Buddhism, Wikipedia article audio. Buddhism is a religion and dharma that encompasses a variety of traditions, beliefs, and spiritual practices largely based on original teachings attributed to the Buddha and resulting interpreted philosophies. Buddhism originated in ancient India sometime between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, from where it spread through much of Asia, whereafter it declined in India during the Middle Ages. Two major extant branches of Buddhism are generally recognized by scholars: Theravada and Mahayana. Buddhism is the world's fourth largest religion, with over 520 million followers or over 7% of the global population, known as Buddhists. Buddhist schools vary on the exact nature of the path to liberation, the importance and canonicity of various teachings and scriptures, and especially their respective practices. Practices of Buddhism include taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, study of scriptures, observance of moral precepts, renunciation of craving and attachment, the practice of meditation, the cultivation of wisdom, loving kindness, and compassion, the Mahayana practice of Bodhisattva and the Vajrayana practices of generation stage and completion stage. Life of the Buddha. The problem of life, endless rebirth. In Theravada, the ultimate goal is the cessation of kleshas and the attainment of the sublime state of nirvana, achieved by practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, thus escaping what is seen as a cycle of suffering and rebirth. Theravada has a widespread following in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Mahayana, which includes the traditions of Pure Land, Zen, Nichiren Buddhism, Shingon, and Tiantai, is found throughout East Asia. Rather than nirvana, Mahayana instead aspires to Buddhahood via the Bodhisattva path, a state wherein one remains in the cycle of rebirth to help other beings reach awakening. Vajrayana, a body of teachings attributed to Indian siddhas, may be viewed as a third branch or merely a part of Mahayana. Tibetan Buddhism, which preserves the Vajrayana teachings of 8th century India, is practiced in regions surrounding the Himalayas, Mongolia, and Kalmykia. Tibetan Buddhism aspires to Buddhahood or rainbow body. Buddhism is an Indian religion attributed to the teachings of the Buddha, supposedly born Siddhartha Gautama, and also known as the Tathagata and Sakyamuni. The details of Buddha's life are mentioned in many early Buddhist texts but are inconsistent, and his social background and life details are difficult to prove, the precise dates uncertain. The evidence of the early texts suggests that he was born as Siddhartha Gautama in Lumbini and grew up in Kapilavastu, a town in the plains region of the modern Nepal-India border, and that he spent his life in what is now modern Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. Some hagiographic legends state that his father was a king named Suddhodana, his mother was Queen Maya, and he was born in Lumbini Gardens. However, scholars such as Richard Gombrich consider this a dubious claim because a combination of evidence suggests he was born in the Shakyas community, one that later gave him the title Shakyamuni, and the Shakya community was governed by a small oligarchy or republic-like council where there were no ranks but where seniority mattered instead. Some of the stories about Buddha, his life, his teachings, and claims about the society he grew up in may have been invented and interpolated at a later time into the Buddhist texts. Four Noble Truths dukkha and its ending. According to the Buddhist sutras, Gautama was moved by the innate suffering of humanity and its endless repetition due to rebirth. He set out on a quest to end this repeated suffering. Early Buddhist canonical texts and early biographies of Gautama state that Gautama first studied under Vedic teachers, namely Alara Lama and Udaka Ramaputta, learning meditation and ancient philosophies, particularly the concept of nothingness, emptiness from the former, and what is neither seen nor unseen from the latter. Finding these teachings to be insufficient to attain his goal, he turned to the practice of asceticism. This too fell short of attaining his goal, and then he turned to the practice of dhyana, meditation, which he had already discovered in his youth. He famously sat in meditation under a ficus religiosa tree now called the Bodhi tree in the town of Bodh Gaya in the Gangetic Plains region of South Asia. He gained insight into the workings of karma in his former lives, and attained enlightenment, certainty about the middle way as the right path of spiritual practice to end suffering from rebirths in Sasra. The cycle of rebirth. As a fully enlightened Buddha, he attracted followers and founded a Sangha. Now, as the Buddha, he spent the rest of his life teaching the Dharma he had discovered, and died at the age of 80 in Kushinagar, India. Buddha's teachings were propagated by his followers, which in the last centuries of the first millennium BCE became over 18 Buddhist sub-schools of thought, each with its own basket of texts containing different interpretations and authentic teachings of the Buddha. These over time evolved into many traditions, of which the more well-known and widespread in the modern era are Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana Buddhism. The Four Truths express the basic orientation of Buddhism: we crave and cling to impermanent states and things, which is dukkha, incapable of satisfying and painful. This keeps us caught in sasra, the endless cycle of repeated rebirth, dukkha, and dying again. But there is a way to liberation from this endless cycle to the state of nirvana, namely following the Noble Eightfold Path. Sasra. The truth of dukkha is the basic insight that life in this mundane world, with its clinging and craving to impermanent states and things, is dukkha, and unsatisfactory. Dukkha can be translated as incapable of satisfying, the unsatisfactory nature and the general insecurity of all conditioned phenomena, or painful. Dukkha is most commonly translated as suffering, which is an incorrect translation, since it refers not to literal suffering, but to the ultimately unsatisfactory nature of temporary states and things, including pleasant but temporary experiences. We expect happiness from states and things which are impermanent, and therefore cannot attain real happiness. Rebirth. In Buddhism, dukkha is one of the three marks of existence, along with impermanence and innate. Buddhism, like other major Indian religions, asserts that everything is impermanent, but, unlike them, also asserts that there is no permanent self or soul in living beings. The ignorance or misperception that anything is permanent or that there is self in any being is considered a wrong understanding, and the primary source of clinging and dukkha. Karma. Dukkha arises when we crave and cling to these changing phenomena. The clinging and craving produces karma, which ties us to samsara, the round of death and rebirth. Craving includes kama-tanha, craving for sense pleasures, bhava-tanha, craving to continue the cycle of life and death, including rebirth, and vibhava-tanha, craving to not experience the world and painful feelings. Dukkha ceases, or can be confined, when craving and clinging cease or are confined. This also means that no more karma is being produced, and rebirth ends. Cessation is nirvana, blowing out, and peace of mind. Liberation. By following the Buddhist path to moksha, liberation, one starts to disengage from craving and clinging to impermanent states and things. The term path is usually taken to mean the Noble Eightfold Path, but other versions of the path can also be found in the Nikayas. The Theravada tradition regards insight into the Four Truths as liberating in itself. Sasram means wandering or world, with the connotation of cyclic, circuitous change. It refers to the theory of rebirth and cyclicality of all life, matter, existence, a fundamental assumption of Buddhism, as with all major Indian religions. Samsara in Buddhism is considered to be dukkha, unsatisfactory and painful, perpetuated by desire and avidya, and the resulting karma. The theory of rebirths, and realms in which these rebirths can occur, is extensively developed in Buddhism, in particular Tibetan Buddhism with its wheel of existence doctrine. Liberation from this cycle of existence, nirvana, has been the foundation and the most important historical justification of Buddhism. The later Buddhist texts assert that rebirth can occur in 6 realms of existence, namely 3 good realms and 3 evil realms. Samsara ends if a person attains nirvana, the blowing out of the desires and the gaining of true insight into impermanence and non-self reality. Rebirth refers to a process whereby beings go through a succession of lifetimes as one of many possible forms of sentient life, each running from conception to death. In Buddhist thought, this rebirth does not involve any soul, because of its doctrine of an it which rejects the concepts of a permanent self or an unchanging, eternal soul, as it is called in Hinduism and Christianity. According to Buddhism, there ultimately is no such thing as a self in any being or any essence in anything. The path to liberation, bhavana. The Buddhist traditions have traditionally disagreed on what it is in a person that is reborn, as well as how quickly the rebirth occurs after each death. Some Buddhist traditions assert that no self doctrine means that there is no perduring self, but there is avasaya self which migrates from one life to another. The majority of Buddhist traditions, in contrast, assert that vijnana, though evolving, exists as a continuum and is the mechanistic basis of what undergoes rebirth, rebecoming, and redyath. The rebirth depends on the merit or demerit gained by one's karma, as well as that accrued on one's behalf by a family member. Refuge in the 3 jewels. Each rebirth takes place within one of 5 realms according to Theravadins, or 6 according to other schools: heavenly, demigods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts and hellish. The Buddha, the Gautama, the Blessed One, the awakened with true knowledge, the Dharma, the precepts, the practice, the 4 truths, the Eightfold Path, the Sangha, order of monks, the community of Buddha's disciples. In East Asian and Tibetan Buddhism, rebirth is not instantaneous, and there is an intermediate state between one life and the next. The orthodox Theravada position rejects the wait, and asserts that rebirth of a being is immediate. However, there are passages in the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon that seem to lend support to the idea that the Buddha taught about an intermediate stage between one life and the next. In Buddhism, karma drives sasra, the endless cycle of suffering and rebirth for each being. Good, skillful deeds and bad, unskillful deeds produce seeds in the unconscious receptacle that mature later either in this life or in a subsequent rebirth. The existence of karma is a core belief in Buddhism. As with all major Indian religions, it implies neither fatalism nor that everything that happens to a person is caused by karma. Both Theravada and Mahayana traditions accept the Buddha as the founder. Theravada considers him unique, but Mahayana considers him one of many Buddhas. Both accept the middle way, dependent origination, the 4 noble truths, the noble eightfold path and the 3 marks of existence, nirvana is attainable by the monks in Theravada tradition, while Mahayana considers it broadly attainable. Arhat state is aimed for in the Theravada, while Buddhahood is aimed for in the Mahayana. Religious practice consists of meditation for monks and prayer for lay persons in Theravada, while Mahayana includes prayer, chanting and meditation for both. Theravada has been a more rationalist, historical form of Buddhism, while Mahayana has included more rituals, mysticism, and worldly flexibility in its scope. A central aspect of Buddhist theory of karma is that intent matters and is essential to bring about a consequence or phala fruit or vipaka result. However, good or bad karma accumulates even if there is no physical action, and just having ill or good thoughts create karmic seeds. Thus, actions of body, speech, or mind all lead to karmic seeds. In the Buddhist traditions, life aspects affected by the law of karma in past and current births of a being include the form of rebirth, realm of rebirth, social class, character, and major circumstances of a lifetime. It operates like the laws of physics, without external intervention, on every being in all 6 realms of existence including human beings and gods. The Buddhist Path. Theravada Noble Eightfold Path, Mahayana Bodhisattva Path and the 6 Paramitas. Law Buddhist Ethics. A notable aspect of the karma theory in Buddhism is merit transfer. A person accumulates merit not only through intentions and ethical living, but also is able to gain merit from others by exchanging goods and services, such as through dana. Further, a person can transfer one's own good karma to living family members and ancestors. The cessation of the kleshas and the attainment of nirvana, with which the cycle of rebirth ends, has been the primary and the soteriological goal of the Buddhist path for monastic life, since the time of the Buddha. The term path is usually taken to mean the Noble Eightfold Path, but other versions of the path can also be found in the Nikayas. In some passages in the Pali Canon, a distinction is being made between right knowledge or insight, and right liberation or release, as the means to attain cessation and liberation. Nirvana literally means blowing out, quenching, becoming extinguished. In early Buddhist texts, it is the state of restraint and self-control that leads to the blowing out and the ending of the cycles of sufferings associated with rebirths and redyaths. Many later Buddhist texts describe nirvana as identical with anatta, with complete emptiness, nothingness. In some texts, the state is described with greater detail, such as passing through the gate of emptiness, realizing that there is no soul or self in any living being, then passing through the gate of signlessness, realizing that nirvana cannot be perceived, and finally passing through the gate of wishlessness, realizing that nirvana is the state of not even wishing for nirvana. The nirvana state has been described in Buddhist texts partly in a manner similar to other Indian religions, as the state of complete liberation, enlightenment, highest happiness, bliss, fearlessness, freedom, permanence, non-dependent origination, unfathomable, and indescribable. It has also been described in part differently, as a state of spiritual release marked by emptiness and realization of non-self. While Buddhism considers the liberation from sasra as the ultimate spiritual goal, in traditional practice, the primary focus of a vast majority of lay Buddhists has been to seek and accumulate merit through good deeds, donations to monks and various Buddhist rituals in order to gain better rebirths rather than nirvana. While the Noble Eightfold Path is best known in the West, a wide variety of practices and stages have been used and described in the Buddhist traditions. Basic practices include sila, samadhi, and prajna, as described in the Noble Eightfold Path. An important additional practice is a kind and compassionate attitude toward every living being in the world. Devotion is also important in some Buddhist traditions, and in the Tibetan traditions visualizations of deities and mandalas are important. The value of textual study is regarded differently in the various Buddhist traditions. It is central to Theravada and highly important to Tibetan Buddhism, while the Zen tradition takes an ambiguous stance. Traditionally, the first step in most Buddhist schools requires taking 3 refuges, also called the 3 jewels, as the foundation of one's religious practice. Pali texts employ the Brahmanical motif of the triple refuge, found in the Rigveda 9.97.47, Rigveda 6.46.9, and Chandogya Upanishad 2.22.34. Tibetan Buddhism sometimes adds a 4th refuge, in the Lama. The 3 refuges are believed by Buddhists to be protective in a form of reverence. Precepts. The 3 jewels are: reciting the 3 refuges is considered in Buddhism not as a place to hide, rather a thought that purifies, uplifts and strengthens. An important guiding principle of Buddhist practice is the middle way. It was a part of Buddha's first sermon, where he presented the Noble Eightfold Path that was a middle way between the extremes of asceticism and hedonistic sense pleasures. In Buddhism, states Harvey, the doctrine of dependent arising to explain rebirth is viewed as the middle way between the doctrines that a being has a permanent soul involved in rebirth and death is final and there is no rebirth. Vinaya. Samadhi meditation. Origins. In the Theravada canon, the Pali Suttas, various often irreconcilable sequences can be found. According to Carol Anderson, the Theravada canon lacks an overriding and comprehensive structure of the path to Nibbana. Nevertheless, the Noble Eightfold Path, or Eightfold Path of the Noble Ones, has become an important description of the Buddhist path. It consists of a set of 8 interconnected factors or conditions, that when developed together, lead to the cessation of dukkha. These 8 factors are: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This Eightfold Path is the 4th of the 4 Noble Truths, and asserts the path to the cessation of dukkha. The path teaches that the way of the enlightened ones stopped their craving, clinging and karmic accumulations, and thus ended their endless cycles of rebirth and suffering. The Noble Eightfold Path is grouped into 3 basic divisions, as follows. Mahina Buddhism is based principally upon the path of a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva refers to one who is on the path to Buddhahood. The term Mahina was originally a synonym for bodhisattvana or bodhisattva vehicle. In the earliest texts of Mahayana Buddhism, the path of a bodhisattva was to awaken the bodhicitta. Between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, this tradition introduced the 10 Bhumi doctrine, which means 10 levels or stages of awakening. This development was followed by the acceptance that it is impossible to achieve Buddhahood in one lifetime, and the best goal is not nirvana for oneself, but Buddhahood after climbing through the 10 levels during multiple rebirths. Mahayana scholars then outlined an elaborate path for monks and lay people, and the path includes the vow to help teach Buddhist knowledge to other beings, so as to help them cross samsara and liberate themselves, once one reaches the Buddhahood in a future rebirth. One part of this path are the pramit, derived from the Jataka's tales of Buddha's numerous rebirths. 4 Rupayana and 4 Arupayana. The Mahayana texts are inconsistent in their discussion of the paramitas, and some texts include lists of 2, others 4, 6, 10, and 52. The 6 paramitas have been most studied, and these are: in Mahayana sutras that include 10 paramitas, the additional 4 perfections are skillful means, vow, power, and knowledge. The most discussed paramita and the highest rated perfection in Mahayana texts is the Prajnaparamita, or the perfection of insight. This insight in the Mahayana tradition, states Shei Ichimura, has been the insight of non-duality or the absence of reality in all things. La or Sla is the concept of moral virtues, that is the second group and an integral part of the Noble Eightfold Path. It consists of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Law appear as ethical precepts for both lay and ordained Buddhist devotees. It includes the 5 precepts for lay people, 8 or 10 precepts for monastic life, as well as rules of Dhamma adopted by a monastery. The 5 precepts are moral, behavioral and ritual guidelines for lay devotees in Buddhism, while those following a monastic life have rules of conduct. The 5 precepts apply to both male and female devotees, and these are: these precepts are not commandments and transgressions do not invite religious sanctions, but their power has been in the Buddhist belief in karmic consequences and their impact in afterlife during rebirth. Killing in Buddhist belief leads to rebirth in the hellish realm, and for a longer time in more severe conditions if the murder victim was a monk. Adultery, similarly, invites a rebirth as prostitute or in hell, depending on whether the partner was unmarried or married. Saving animals from slaughter for meat is believed to be a way to acquire merit for better rebirth. These moral precepts have been voluntarily self-enforced in lay Buddhist culture through the associated belief in karma and rebirth. The monastic life in Buddhism has additional precepts as part of Patimokkha, and unlike lay people, transgressions by monks do invite sanctions. Full expulsion from Sangha follows any instance of killing, engaging in sexual intercourse, theft, or false claims about one's knowledge. Temporary expulsion follows a lesser offense. The sanctions vary by the monastic fraternity. The precepts for monks in many Buddhist fraternities are 8 or 10. 4 of these are same as for the lay devotee: no killing, no stealing, no lying, and no intoxicants. The other 4 precepts are: some Sangha add 2 more precepts: abstain from dancing and singing, and abstain from accepting money. In addition to these precepts, Buddhist monasteries have hundreds of rules of Dhamma conduct, which are a part of its Patimokkha. Vinaya is the specific code of conduct for a Sangha of monks or nuns. It includes the Patimokkha, a set of 227 offences including 75 rules of decorum for monks, along with penalties for transgression, in the Theravadan tradition. The precise content of the Vinaya Pitaka differs in different schools and tradition, and different monasteries set their own standards on its implementation. The list of Patimokkha is recited every fortnight in a ritual gathering of all monks. Buddhist text with Vinaya rules for monasteries have been traced in all Buddhist traditions, with the oldest surviving being the ancient Chinese translations. Meditation and insight. The Brahmavihara. Monastic communities in the Buddhist tradition cut normal social ties to family and community, and live as islands unto themselves. Within a monastic fraternity, a Sangha has its own rules. A monk abides by these institutionalized rules, and living life as the Vinaya prescribes it is not merely a means, but very nearly the end in itself. Transgressions by a monk on Sangha Vinaya rules invites enforcement, which can include temporary or permanent expulsion. A wide range of meditation practices has developed in the Buddhist traditions, but meditation primarily refers to the practice of dhyana dhyana. It is a practice in which the attention of the mind is first narrowed to the focus on one specific object, such as the breath, a concrete object, or a specific thought, mental image, or mantra. After this initial focusing of the mind, the focus is coupled to mindfulness, maintaining a calm mind while being aware of one's surroundings. The practice of dhyana aids in maintaining a calm mind, and avoiding disturbance of this calm mind by mindfulness of disturbing thoughts and feelings. Visualizations, deities, mandalas. The earliest evidence of yogis and their meditative tradition, states Carol Werner, is found in the Kezan hymn 10.136 of the Rigveda. While evidence suggests meditation was practiced in the centuries preceding the Buddha, the meditative methodologies described in the Buddhist texts are some of the earliest among texts that have survived into the modern era. These methodologies likely incorporate what existed before the Buddha as well as those first developed within Buddhism. Practice, monks, laity. Prajin site. Origins 2. Theravada. Vipassana. Dependent arising. Mahayana. Emptiness. Representation oni CQ mind only. Buddha nature. Devotion. Buddhist texts. Pli Tipitaka. Theravada texts. According to Bronkhorst, the four dhyanas was a Buddhist invention. Bronkhorst notes that the Buddhist canon has a mass of contradictory statements, little is known about their relative chronology, and there can be no doubt that the canon including the older parts, the Sutra and Vinaya Pitaka was composed over a long period of time. Meditative practices were incorporated from other Sramanic movements. The Buddhist texts describe how Buddha learnt the practice of the formless dhyana from Brahmanical practices, in the Nikayas ascribed to Alarika Lama and Uddaka Ramaputa. The Buddhist canon also describes and criticizes alternative dhyana practices, which likely mean the pre-existing mainstream meditation practices of Jainism and Hinduism. Buddha added a new focus and interpretation, particularly through the four dhyanas methodology, in which mindfulness is maintained. Further, the focus of meditation and the underlying theory of liberation guiding the meditation has been different in Buddhism. For example, states Bronkhorst, the verse April 4, 23 of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad with its become calm, subdued, quiet, patiently enduring, concentrated, one sees soul in oneself is most probably a meditative state. The Buddhist discussion of meditation is without the concept of soul, and the discussion criticizes both the ascetic meditation of Jainism and the real self, soul meditation of Hinduism. For nirvana, Buddhist texts teach various meditation methodologies, of which Rupayana and Arupayana have been the most studied. These are described in the Pali Canon as trance-like states in the world of desirelessness. The four dhyanas under Rupayanas are. The Arupayanas are also four, which are entered by those who have mastered the Rupayanas. The first formless dhyana gets to infinite space without form or color or shape, the second to infinity of perception base of the infinite space, the third formless dhyana transcends object-subject perception base, while the fourth is where he dwells in nothing at all, where there are no feelings, no ideas, nor are there non-ideas, unto total cessation. The 4 Rupa dhyanas in Buddhist practice lead to rebirth in successfully better Rupa Brahma heavenly realms, while Arupa dhyanas lead into Arupa heavens. Richard Gombrich notes that the sequence of the 4 Rupa dhyanas describes 2 different cognitive states. The first 2 describe a narrowing of attention, while in the 3rd and 4th dhyana attention is expanded again. Alexander Wynne further explains that the dhyana scheme is poorly understood. According to Wynne, words expressing the inculcation of awareness, such as sati, sampajno, and upek, are mistranslated or understood as particular factors of meditative states, whereas they refer to a particular way of perceiving the sense objects. The Buddhist tradition has incorporated 2 traditions regarding the use of dhyana. There is a tradition that stresses attaining prajna as the means to awakening and liberation. But it has also incorporated the yogic tradition, as reflected in the use of dhyana, which is rejected in other sutras as not resulting in the final result of liberation. Lambert Schmidhausen, a professor of Buddhist studies, discerns 3 possible roads to liberation as described in the suttas, to which Vetter adds the sole practice of dhyana itself. According to Vetter and Bronkhorst, the earliest Buddhist path consisted of a set of practices which culminate in the practice of dhyana, leading to a calm of mind which according to Vetter is the liberation which is being sought. Later on, liberating insight came to be regarded as equally liberating. This liberating insight came to be exemplified by prajna, or the insight in the 4 truths, but also by other elements of the Buddhist teachings. The 4 immeasurables or 4 abodes, also called Brahmaviharas, are virtues or directions for meditation in Buddhist traditions, which helps a person be reborn in the heavenly realm. These are traditionally believed to be a characteristic of the deity Brahma and the heavenly abode he resides in. The 4 Brahmavihara are: according to Peter Harvey, the Buddhist scriptures acknowledge that the 4 Brahmavihara meditation practices did not originate within the Buddhist tradition. The Brahmavihara, along with the tradition of meditation and the above 4 immeasurables, are found in pre-Buddha and post-Buddha Vedic and Sramanic literature. Aspects of the Brahmavihara practice for rebirths into the heavenly realm have been an important part of Buddhist meditation tradition. According to Gombrich, the Buddhist usage of the Brahmavihara originally referred to an awakened state of mind, and a concrete attitude toward other beings which was equal to living with Brahman here and now. The later tradition took those descriptions too literally, linking them to cosmology and understanding them as living with Brahman by rebirth in the Brahma world. According to Gombrich, the Buddha taught that kindness, what Christians tend to call love, was a way to salvation. Idols of deity and icons have been a part of the historic practice, and in Buddhist texts such as the 11th century Sadhanamala, a devotee visualizes and identifies himself or herself with the imagined deity as part of meditation. This has been particularly popular in Vajrayana meditative traditions, but also found in Mahayana and Theravada traditions, particularly in temples and with Buddha images. In Tibetan Buddhism tradition, mandala are mystical maps for the visualization process with cosmic symbolism. There are numerous deities, each with a mandala, and they are used during initiation ceremonies and meditation. The mandalas are concentric geometric shapes symbolizing layers of the external world, gates, and sacred space. The meditation deity is in the center, sometimes surrounded by protective gods and goddesses. Visualizations with deities and mandalas in Buddhism is a tradition traceable to ancient times, and likely well established by the time the 5th century text Visuddhimagga was composed. According to Peter Harvey, whenever Buddhism has been healthy, not only ordained but also more committed lay people have practiced formal meditation. Loud devotional chanting, however, adds Harvey, has been the most prevalent Buddhist practice and considered a form of meditation that produces energy, joy, loving kindness, and calm, purifies mind and benefits the chanter. Throughout most of Buddhist history, meditation has been primarily practiced in Buddhist monastic tradition, and historical evidence suggests that serious meditation by lay people has been an exception. In recent history, sustained meditation has been pursued by a minority of monks in Buddhist monasteries. Western interest in meditation has led to a revival where ancient Buddhist ideas and precepts are adapted to Western mores and interpreted liberally, presenting Buddhism as a meditation-based form of spirituality. Prajna or pa is insight or knowledge of the true nature of existence. The Buddhist tradition regards ignorance, a fundamental ignorance, misunderstanding or misperception of the nature of reality, as one of the basic causes of dukkha and samsara. By overcoming ignorance or misunderstanding, one is enlightened and liberated. This overcoming includes awakening to impermanence and the non-self nature of reality, and this develops dispassion for the objects of clinging, and liberates a being from dukkha and sasra. Prajna is important in all Buddhist traditions, and is the wisdom about the dharmas, functioning of karma and rebirths, realms of samsara, impermanence of everything, no self in anyone or anything, and dependent origination. The origins of liberating insight are unclear. Buddhist texts, states Bronkhorst, do not describe it explicitly, and the content of liberating insight is likely not original to Buddhism. According to Vetter and Bronkhorst, this growing importance of liberating insight was a response to other religious groups in India, which held that a liberating insight was indispensable for moksha, liberation from rebirth. Bronkhorst suggests that the conception of what exactly constituted liberating insight for Buddhists developed over time. Whereas originally it may not have been specified as an insight, later on the Four Noble Truths served as such, to be superseded by Pratityasamutpada, and still later, in the Hinayana schools, by the doctrine of the non-existence of a substantial self or person. Other descriptions of this liberating insight exist in the Buddhist canon, that the 5 skandhas are impermanent, disagreeable, and neither the self nor belonging to oneself. The contemplation of the arising and disappearance of the 5 skandhas, the realization of the skandhas as empty, vain, and without any pith or substance. In the Pali Canon, liberating insight is attained in the 4th dhyana. However, states Vetter, modern scholarship on the Pali Canon has uncovered a whole series of inconsistencies in the transmission of the Buddha's word, and there are many conflicting versions of what constitutes higher knowledge and samadhi that leads to the liberation from rebirth and suffering. Even within the 4 dhyana methodology of meditation, Vetter notes that penetrating abstract truths and penetrating them successively does not seem possible in a state of mind which is without contemplation and reflection. According to Vetter, dhyana itself constituted the original liberating practice. Carol Anderson notes that insight is often depicted in the Vinaya as the opening of the Dhamma eye, which sets one on the Buddhist path to liberation. In Theravada Buddhism, but also in Tibetan Buddhism, 2 types of meditation Buddhist practices are being followed, namely Samatha and Vipassana. Samatha is also called calming meditation, and was adopted into Buddhism from pre-Buddha Indian traditions. Vipassana meditation was added by Buddha, and refers to insight meditation. Vipassana does not aim at peace and tranquility, states Damien Keown, but the generation of penetrating and critical insight. The focus of Vipassana meditation is to continuously and thoroughly know impermanence of everything, no self in anything, and the Dukkha teachings of Buddhism. Contemporary Theravada orthodoxy regards samadhi as a preparation for vipassana, pacifying the mind and strengthening the concentration in order to allow the work of insight, which leads to liberation. In contrast, the Vipassana movement argues that insight levels can be discerned without the need for developing samatha further due to the risks of going out of the course when strong samadhi is developed. Pratityasamutpada, also called dependent arising, or dependent origination, is the Buddhist theory to explain the nature and relations of being, becoming, existence and ultimate reality. Buddhism asserts that there is nothing independent, except the state of nirvana. All physical and mental states depend on and arise from other pre-existing states, and in turn from them arise other dependent states while they cease. The dependent arisings have a causal conditioning, and thus pratityasamutpada is the Buddhist belief that causality is the basis of ontology, not a creator God nor the ontological Vedic concept called universal self nor any other transcendent creative principle. However, the Buddhist thought does not understand causality in terms of Newtonian mechanics, rather it understands it as conditioned arising. In Buddhism, dependent arising is referring to conditions created by a plurality of causes that necessarily originate a phenomenon within and across lifetimes, such as karma in one life creating conditions that lead to rebirth in one of the realms of existence for another lifetime. Buddhism applies the dependent arising theory to explain origination of endless cycles of dukkha and rebirth, through its 12 nidnas or 12 links doctrine. It states that because avidya exists saskras exists, because saskras exists therefore vijnana exists, and in a similar manner it links nmarpa, ayatana, sparsa, vedan, ta, upna, bhava, jadi, and jarmarat. By breaking the circuitous links of the 12 nidanas, Buddhism asserts that liberation from these endless cycles of rebirth and dukkha can be attained. Niyat, or emptiness, is a central concept in Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka school, and widely attested in the Praj Pramit Sutras. It brings together key Buddhist doctrines, particularly anatta and dependent origination, to refute the metaphysics of Sarvastivada and Sautrantika. Not only sentient beings are empty of Atman, all phenomena are without any svabhava, and thus without any underlying essence, and empty of being independent. Thus the heterodox theories of svabhava circulating at the time were refuted on the basis of the doctrines of early Buddhism. Sarvastivada teachings, which were criticized by Nagarjuna, were reformulated by scholars such as Vasubandhu and Asanga and were adapted into the Yogacara school. One of the main features of Yoga philosophy is the concept of Vijñāptimatra. It is often used interchangeably with the term Siddhamtra, but they have different meanings. The standard translation of both terms is consciousness only or mind only. Several modern researchers object to this translation, and the accompanying label of absolute idealism or idealistic monism. A better translation for Vijñāptimatra is representation only, while an alternative translation for Siddhamtra has not been proposed. While the Madhyamaka school held that asserting the existence or non-existence of any ultimately real thing was inappropriate, some later exponents of Yogacara asserted that the mind and only the mind is ultimately real. Vasubandhu and Asanga however did not assert that mind was truly existent, or the basis of all reality. These two schools of thought, in opposition or synthesis, form the basis of subsequent Mahayana metaphysics in the Indo-Tibetan tradition. Buddha nature is a concept found in some first millennium CE Buddhist texts, such as the Tathagatagarbhasutras. This concept has been controversial in Buddhism, but has a following in East Asian Buddhism. These sutras suggest, states Paul Williams, that all sentient beings contain a Tathagata as their essence, core inner nature, self. The Tathagatagarbha doctrine, at its earliest probably appeared about the later part of the 3rd century CE, and it contradicts the Anatta doctrine in a vast majority of Buddhist texts, leading scholars to posit that the Tathagatagarbha Sutras were written to promote Buddhism to non-Buddhists. However, the Buddhist text Ratnagotravibhitaka states that the self implied in Tathagatagarbha doctrine is actually not self. Devotion is an important part of the practice of most Buddhists. Devotional practices include ritual prayer, prostration, offerings, pilgrimage, and chanting. In Pure Land Buddhism, devotion to the Buddha Amitabha is the main practice. In Nichiren Buddhism, devotion to the Lotus Sutra is the main practice. Bhakti has been a common practice in Theravada Buddhism, where offerings and group prayers are made to deities and particularly images of Buddha. According to Carol Werner and other scholars, devotional worship has been a significant practice in Theravada Buddhism, and deep devotion is part of Buddhist traditions starting from the earliest days. Guru devotion is a central practice of Tibetan Buddhism. The Guru is considered essential, and to the Buddhist devotee, the Guru is the enlightened teacher and ritual master in Vajrayana spiritual pursuits. For someone seeking Buddhahood, the Guru is the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, wrote the 12th century Buddhist scholar Sadhanamala. The veneration of and obedience to teachers is also important in Theravada and Zen Buddhism. Buddhism, like all Indian religions, was an oral tradition in ancient times. The Buddha's words, the early doctrines and concepts, and the interpretations were transmitted from one generation to the next by the word of mouth in monasteries, and not through written texts. The first Buddhist canonical texts were likely written down in Sri Lanka, about 400 years after the Buddha died. The texts were part of the Tripitakas, and many versions appeared thereafter claiming to be the words of the Buddha. Scholarly Buddhist commentary texts, with named authors, appeared in India, around the 2nd century CE. These texts were written in Pali or Sanskrit, sometimes regional languages, as palm leaf manuscripts, birch bark, painted scrolls, carved into temple walls, and later on paper. Unlike what the Bible is to Christianity and the Quran is to Islam, but like all major ancient Indian religions, there is no consensus among the different Buddhist traditions as to what constitutes the scriptures or a common canon in Buddhism. The general belief among Buddhists is that the canonical corpus is vast. This corpus includes the ancient sutras organized into Nikayas, itself the part of 3 basket of texts called the Tripitakas. Each Buddhist tradition has its own collection of texts, much of which is translation of ancient Pali and Sanskrit Buddhist texts of India. The Chinese Buddhist canon, for example, includes 2,184 texts in 55 volumes, while the Tibetan canon comprises 1,108 texts all claimed to have been spoken by the Buddha and another 3,461 texts composed by Indian scholars revered in the Tibetan tradition. The Buddhist textual history has been vast, over 40,000 manuscripts mostly Buddhist, some non-Buddhist, were discovered in 1900 in the Dunhuang Chinese cave alone. The Pli Tipitaka, which means 3 baskets, refers to the Vinaya Pitaka, the Sutta Pitaka, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka. These constitute the oldest known canonical works of Buddhism. The Vinaya Pitaka contains disciplinary rules for the Buddhist monasteries. The Sutta Pitaka contains words attributed to the Buddha. The Abhidhamma Pitaka contain expositions and commentaries on the Sutta, and these vary significantly between Buddhist schools. The Pli Tipitaka is the only surviving early Tipitaka. According to some sources, some early schools of Buddhism had 5 or 7 Pitakas. Much of the material in the canon is not specifically Theravadan, but is instead the collection of teachings that this school preserved from the early, non-sectarian body of teachings. According to Peter Harvey, it contains material at odds with later Theravadan orthodoxy. He states, the Theravadins, then, may have added texts to the canon for some time, but they do not appear to have tampered with what they already had from an earlier period. In addition to the Pali Canon, the important commentary texts of the Theravada tradition include the 5th century Visuddhimagga by Buddhaghosa of the Mahavihara school. It includes sections on Shila, Samadhi, Panna as well as Theravada tradition's meditation methodology. The Mahayana Sutras are a very broad genre of Buddhist scriptures that the Mahayana Buddhist tradition holds are original teachings of the Buddha. Some adherents of Mahayana accept both the early teachings and the Mahayana Sutras as authentic teachings of Gautama Buddha, and claim they were designed for different types of persons and different levels of spiritual understanding. The Mahayana Sutras often claim to articulate the Buddha's deeper, more advanced doctrines, reserved for those who follow the Bodhisattva path. That path is explained as being built upon the motivation to liberate all living beings from unhappiness. Hence the name Mahina. The Theravada school does not treat the Mahayana Sutras as authoritative or authentic teachings of the Buddha. Generally, scholars conclude that the Mahayana scriptures were composed from the 1st century CE onwards. Large numbers of Mahayana sutras were being composed in the period between the beginning of the Common Era and the 5th century. Many ancient Indian texts have not survived into the modern era, creating a challenge in establishing the historic commonalities between Theravada and Mahayana. The texts preserved in the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, with parallel Chinese translations, have provided a breakthrough. Among these is the Mahayana text Listambha Sutra, which no longer exists in a Sanskrit version, but does in Tibetan and Chinese versions. This Mahayana text contains numerous sections which are remarkably the same as the Theravada Pali Canon and Nikaya Buddhism. The Listambha Sutra was cited by Mahayana scholars such as the 8th century Yasomitra to be authoritative. This suggests that Buddhist literature of different traditions shared a common core of Buddhist texts in the early centuries of its history, until Mahayana literature diverged about and after the 1st century CE. Historically, the roots of Buddhism lie in the religious thought of Iron Age India around the middle of the 1st millennium BCE. That was a period, states Abraham Arely, of great intellectual ferment, when the Upanishads were composed, marking a change in the historical Vedic religion, as well as the emergence of great Sramanic traditions. According to Richard Gombrich, this was not only a period of intellectual ferment but also socio-cultural change quite distinct from the early Vedic period. New ideas developed both in the Vedic tradition in the form of the Upanishads, and outside of the Vedic tradition through the Rama movements. The term Rama refers to several Indian religious movements parallel to but separate from the historical Vedic religion, including Buddhism, Jainism, and others such as Jaivika. Several Rama movements are known to have existed in India before the 6th century BCE, and these influenced both the Stika and Nstika traditions of Indian philosophy. According to Martin Wilshire, the Sramana tradition evolved in India over two phases, namely Paksha Buddha and Savaka phases, the former being the tradition of individual ascetic and the latter of disciples, and that Buddhism and Jainism ultimately emerged from these. Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical ascetic groups shared and used several similar ideas, but the Rama traditions also drew upon already established Brahmanical concepts and philosophical roots, states Wiltshire, to formulate their own doctrines. Brahmanical motifs can be found in the oldest Buddhist texts, using them to introduce and explain Buddhist ideas. For example, prior to Buddhist developments, the Brahmanical tradition internalized and variously reinterpreted the three Vedic sacrificial fires as concepts such as truth, right, tranquility, or restraint. Buddhist texts also refer to the three Vedic sacrificial fires, reinterpreting and explaining them as ethical conduct. The Sramanic religions challenged and broke with the Brahmanic tradition on core assumptions such as Atman, Brahman, the nature of afterlife, and they rejected the authority of the Vedas and Upanishads. Buddhism was one among several Indian religions that did so. The history of Indian Buddhism may be divided into 5 periods: Early Buddhism, Nikaya Buddhism, or Sectarian Buddhism, the period of the early Buddhist schools, early Mahayana Buddhism, later Mahayana Buddhism, and Vajrayana Buddhism. Pre-sectarian Buddhism is the earliest phase of Buddhism, recognized by nearly all scholars. Its main scriptures are the Vinaya Pitaka and the 4 principal Nikyas or Agamas. Information of the oldest teachings may be obtained by analysis of the oldest texts. One method to obtain information on the oldest core of Buddhism is to compare the oldest extant versions of the Theravadan Pali Canon and other texts. The reliability of these sources, and the possibility to draw out a core of oldest teachings, is a matter of dispute. According to Vetter, inconsistencies remain, and other methods must be applied to resolve those inconsistencies. According to Schmidhausen, 3 positions held by scholars of Buddhism can be distinguished. According to Mitchell, certain basic teachings appear in many places throughout the early texts, which has led most scholars to conclude that Gautama Buddha must have taught something similar to the 4 Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, Nirvana, the 3 Marks of Existence, the 5 Aggregates, dependent origination, karma, and rebirth. Yet critical analysis reveals discrepancies, which point to alternative possibilities. Bruce Matthews notes that there is no cohesive presentation of karma in the Sutta Pitaka, which may mean that the doctrine was incidental to the main perspective of early Buddhist soteriology. Schmidhausen has questioned whether karma already played a role in the theory of rebirth of earliest Buddhism. According to Vetter, the Buddha at first sought the deathless, which is concerned with the here and now. Only later did he become acquainted with the doctrine of rebirth. Bronkhorst disagrees, and concludes that the Buddha introduced a concept of karma that differed considerably from the commonly held views of his time. According to Bronkhorst, not physical and mental activities as such were seen as responsible for rebirth, but intentions and desire. Another core problem in the study of early Buddhism is the relation between dhyana and insight. Schmidhausen states that the 4 Noble Truths as liberating insight may be a later addition to texts such as Majjhima Nikaya 36. According to both Bronkhorst and Anderson, the 4 Noble Truths became a substitution for prajna, or liberating insight, in the suttas in those texts where a liberating insight was preceded by the four gunas. The Four Truths may not have been formulated in earliest Buddhism, and did not serve in earliest Buddhism as a description of liberating insight. Gautama's teachings may have been personal, adjusted to the need of each person. The three marks of existence dukkha, anicca, anatta may reflect Upanishad or other influences. Kr. Norman supposes that these terms were already in use at the Buddha's time, and were familiar to his hearers. According to Vetter, the description of the Buddhist path may initially have been as simple as the term the middle way. In time, this short description was elaborated, resulting in the description of the Eightfold Path. Similarly, Nibbana is the common term for the desired goal of this practice, yet many other terms can be found throughout the Nikyas, which are not specified. Mahayana Sutras. Listambha Sutra. History. Historical roots. Indian Buddhism. Pre-sectarian Buddhism. Tracing the oldest teachings. Core teachings. According to the scriptures, soon after the parinirvana of Gautama Buddha, the first Buddhist council was held. As with any ancient Indian tradition, transmission of teaching was done orally. The primary purpose of the assembly was to collectively recite the teachings to ensure that no errors occurred in oral transmission. Richard Gombrich states that the monastic assembly recitations of the Buddha's teaching likely began during Buddha's lifetime, similar to the first council, that helped compose Buddhist scriptures. The second Buddhist council resulted in the first schism in the Sangha, probably caused by a group of reformists called Sthavaras who split from the conservative majority Mazgikas. After unsuccessfully trying to modify the Vinaya, a small group of elderly members, i.e. Sthavaras, broke away from the majority Mazgika during the Second Buddhist Council, giving rise to the Sthavara sect. The Sthavaras gave rise to several schools, one of which was the Theravada school. Originally, these schisms were caused by disputes over monastic disciplinary codes of various fraternities, but eventually, by about 100 CE if not earlier, schisms were being caused by doctrinal disagreements too. Buddhist monks of different fraternities became distinct schools and stopped doing official Sangha business together, but continued to study each other's doctrines. Following the schisms, each Sangha started to accumulate their own version of Tripitaka. In their Tripitaka, each school included the suttas of the Buddha, a Vinaya basket, and added an Abhidharma basket, which were texts on detailed scholastic classification, summary, and interpretation of the suttas. The doctrine details in the Abhidharmas of various Buddhist schools differ significantly, and these were composed starting about the 3rd century BCE and through the 1st millennium CE. 18 early Buddhist schools are known, each with its own Tripitaka, but only one collection from Sri Lanka has survived, in a nearly complete state, into the modern era. Several scholars have suggested that the Mahayana Buddhism tradition started in South India, and it is there that Prajnaparamita Sutras, among the earliest Mahayana sutras, developed among the Mazgika along the Ka River region about the 1st century BCE. There is no evidence that Mahayana ever referred to a separate formal school or sect of Buddhism, but rather that it existed as a certain set of ideals, and later doctrines, for bodhisattvas. Initially it was known as Bodhisattvana. Paul Williams states that the Mahina never had nor ever attempted to have a separate Vinaya or ordination codes from the early schools of Buddhism. Records written by Chinese monks visiting India indicate that both Mahina and non-Mahina monks could be found in the same monasteries, with the difference that Mahayana monks worshipped figures of bodhisattvas, while non-Mahayana monks did not. Much of the early extant evidence for the origins of Mahina comes from early Chinese translations of Mahina texts. These Mahayana teachings were first propagated into China by Lokakma, the first translator of Mahayana sutras into Chinese during the 2nd century CE. Some scholars have traditionally considered the earliest Mahinastras to include the very first versions of the Prajnaparamita series, along with texts concerning Akobhya, which were probably composed in the 1st century BCE in the south of India. During the period of late Mahayana Buddhism, 4 major types of thought developed: Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Tathagatagarbha, and Buddhist logic as the last and most recent. In India, the 2 main philosophical schools of the Mahayana were the Madhyamaka and the later Yogacara. According to Dan Lusthaus, Madhyamaka and Yogacara have a great deal in common, and the commonality stems from early Buddhism. There were no great Indian teachers associated with Tathagatagarbha thought. Scholarly research concerning esoteric Buddhism is still in its early stages and has a number of problems that make research difficult. Buddhism may have spread only slowly in India until the time of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, who was a public supporter of the religion. The support of Asoka and his descendants led to the construction of more stupas and to efforts to spread Buddhism throughout the enlarged Maurya Empire and into neighboring lands such as Central Asia, beyond the Maurya's northwest border, and to the island of Sri Lanka south of India. These 2 missions, in opposite directions, would ultimately lead, in the first case to the spread of Buddhism into China, and in the second case, to the emergence of Theravada Buddhism and its spread from Sri Lanka to the coastal lands of Southeast Asia. This period marks the first known spread of Buddhism beyond India. According to the edicts of Asoka, emissaries were sent to various countries west of India to spread Buddhism, particularly in eastern provinces of the neighboring Seleucid Empire, and even farther to Hellenistic kingdoms of the Mediterranean. It is a matter of disagreement among scholars whether or not these emissaries were accompanied by Buddhist missionaries. In Central and West Asia, Buddhist influence grew, through Greek-speaking Buddhist monarchs and ancient Asian trade routes. An example of this is evidenced in Chinese and Pali Buddhist records, such as Milandipanha and the Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhra. The Milandipanha describes a conversation between a Buddhist monk and the 2nd century BCE Greek king Menander, after which Menander abdicates and himself goes into monastic life in the pursuit of nirvana. Some scholars have questioned the Milandipanha version, expressing doubts whether Menander was Buddhist or just favorably disposed to Buddhist monks. Other examples of the influence of Greco-Buddhism can be seen in the history of the school of Dharmaguptaka. This early Buddhist school, active in northwestern India, was in all probability founded by a Greek monk by the name Yonika Dhammarakkhita, native of Alasanda. The Theravada school spread south from India in the 3rd century BCE, to Sri Lanka, and later to Southeast Asia. The Silk Road transmission of Buddhism to China is most commonly thought to have started in the late 2nd or the 1st century CE, though the literary sources are all open to question. The first documented translation efforts by foreign Buddhist monks in China were in the 2nd century CE, probably as a consequence of the expansion of the Kushan Empire into the Chinese territory of the Darim Basin. In the 2nd century CE, Mahayana sutras spread to China, and then to Korea and Japan, and were translated into Chinese. During the Indian period of esoteric Buddhism, Buddhism spread from India to Tibet and Mongolia. Johannes Bronkhorst states that the esoteric form was attractive because it allowed both a secluded monastic community as well as the social rites and rituals important to laypersons and to kings for the maintenance of a political state during succession and wars to resist invasion. During the Middle Ages, Buddhism slowly declined in India, while it vanished from Persia and Central Asia as Islam became the state religion. Buddhists generally classify themselves as either Theravada or Mahayana. This classification is also used by some scholars and is the one ordinarily used in the English language. An alternative scheme used by some scholars divides Buddhism into the following three traditions or geographical or cultural areas: Theravada, East Asian Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. Some scholars use other schemes. Buddhists themselves have a variety of other schemes. Hinayana is used by Mahayana followers to name the family of early philosophical schools and traditions from which contemporary Theravada emerged, but as the Hinayana term is considered derogatory, a variety of other terms are used instead, including Ravakana, Nikaya Buddhism, early Buddhist schools, sectarian Buddhism, and conservative Buddhism. Not all traditions of Buddhism share the same philosophical outlook, or treat the same concepts as central. Each tradition, however, does have its own core concepts, and some comparisons can be drawn between them. This is a rough timeline of the development of the different schools/traditions. Timeline, development and propagation of Buddhist traditions. Nyingma. The Theravada tradition traces its roots to the words of the Buddha preserved in the Pali Canon, and considers itself to be the more orthodox form of Buddhism. Theravada flourished in South India and Sri Lanka in ancient times. From there it spread for the first time into mainland Southeast Asia about the 11th century into its elite urban centers. By the 13th century, Theravada had spread widely into the rural areas of mainland Southeast Asia, displacing Mahayana Buddhism and some traditions of Hinduism which had arrived in places such as Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia around the mid-1st millennium CE. The later traditions were well established in South Thailand and Java by the 7th century, under the sponsorship of the Srivijaya dynasty. The political separation between Khmer and Sukhothai led the Sukhothai king to welcome Sri Lankan emissaries, helping them establish the first Theravada Buddhist Sangha in the 13th century, in contrast to the Mahayana tradition of Khmer earlier. Sinhalese Buddhist reformers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries portrayed the Pali Canon as the original version of scripture. They also emphasized Theravada being rational and scientific. Theravada is primarily practiced today in Sri Lanka, Burma, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia as well as small portions of China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. It has a growing presence in the West. Mahayana schools consider the Mahayana Sutras as authoritative scriptures and accurate rendering of Buddha's words. These traditions have been the more liberal form of Buddhism, allowing different and new interpretations that emerged over time. Mahayana flourished in India from the time of Ashoka, through to the dynasty of the Guptas. Mahayana monastic foundations and centers of learning were established by the Buddhist kings, and the Hindu kings of the Gupta dynasty as evidenced by records left by 3 Chinese visitors to India. The Gupta dynasty, for example, helped establish the famed Enland University in Bihar. These monasteries and foundations helped Buddhist scholarship, as well as studies into non-Buddhist traditions and secular subjects such as medicine, host visitors, and spread Buddhism into East and Central Asia. Native Mahayana Buddhism is practiced today in China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, parts of Russia and most of Vietnam. The Buddhism practiced in Tibet, the Himalayan regions, and Mongolia is also Mahayana in origin, but is discussed below under the heading of Vajrayana. There are a variety of strands in Eastern Buddhism, of which the Pure Land school of Mahayana is the most widely practiced today. In most of this area, however, they are fused into a single unified form of Buddhism. In Japan in particular, they form separate denominations, with the five major ones being Nichiren, peculiar to Japan, Pure Land, Shinjin, a form of Vajrayana, Tendai, and Zen. In Korea, nearly all Buddhists belong to the Kogye school, which is officially Sun, but with substantial elements from other traditions. The goal and philosophy of the Vajrayana remains Mahinist, but its methods are seen by its followers as far more powerful, so as to lead to Buddhahood in just one lifetime. The practice of using mantras was adopted from Hinduism, where they were first used in the Vedas. Tantric Buddhism is largely concerned with ritual and meditative practices. Various classes of Vajrayana literature developed as a result of royal courts sponsoring both Buddhism and Saivism. The Manjusrimulakalpa, which later came to classified under Kryotantra, states that mantras taught in the Saiva, Garuda, and Vaisnava tantras will be effective if applied by Buddhists, since they were all taught originally by Manjushri. The Guhya Siddhi of Padmavihara, a work associated with the Guhya Samaha tradition, prescribes acting as a Saiva guru and initiating members into Saiva Siddhanta scriptures and mandalas. The Samvara Tantra texts adopted the Pitha list from the Saiva text Tantrasadbhava, introducing a copying error where a deity was mistaken for a place. Tibetan Buddhism preserves the Vajrayana teachings of 8th century India. Tantric Buddhism is largely concerned with ritual and meditative practices. A central feature of Buddhist Tantra is deity yoga, which includes visualization and identification with an enlightened yudam or meditation deity and its associated mandala. Another element of Tantra is the need for ritual initiation or empowerment by a guru or lama. Some tantras like the Guhya Samja Tantra features new forms of antinomian ritual practice, such as the use taboo substances like alcohol, sexual yoga, and charnel ground practices which evoke wrathful deities. Zen Buddhism, pronounced Chan in Chinese, Sen in Korean or Zen in Japanese, is a form of Mahayana Buddhism found in China, Korea, and Japan. It lays special emphasis on meditation, and direct discovery of the Buddha nature. Zen Buddhism is divided into two main schools, Rinzai and St, the former greatly favoring the use in meditation on the koan as a device for spiritual breakthrough, and the latter focusing more on shikantaza or just sitting. Zen Buddhism is primarily found in Japan, with some presence in South Korea and Vietnam. The scholars of Japanese Soto Zen tradition in recent times have critiqued the mainstream Japanese Buddhism for Datavada, that is, assuming things have substantiality, a view they assert to be non-Buddhist and out of tune with the teachings of non-self and conditioned arising, states Peter Harvey. There is growing worldwide interest in Buddhism. Buddhism has spread across the world, and Buddhist texts are increasingly translated into local languages. While in the West Buddhism is often seen as exotic and progressive, in the East it is regarded as familiar and traditional. In countries such as Cambodia and Bhutan, it is recognized as the state religion and receives government support. In certain regions such as Afghanistan and Pakistan, Buddhist monuments have been targets of violence and destruction. Modern influences increasingly lead to new forms of Buddhism that are diverse and that significantly depart from traditional beliefs and practices. A number of modern movements or tendencies in Buddhism emerged during the second half of the 20th century, including the Navayana school and Dalit Buddhist movement launched by Br. Ambedkar. The Navayana rejects the foundational doctrines and practices accepted by traditional Theravada and Mahayana traditions, by discarding ideas such as monk lifestyle after renunciation, karma, rebirth, samsara, meditation, nirvana, Four Noble Truths and others. Ambedkar's Navayana Buddhism considers these as superstitions and reinterprets the original Buddha as someone who taught about class struggle and social equality. Modern Buddhist movements include One Buddhism in Korea, the Dhammakaya movement in Thailand and several Japanese organizations, such as Shinyuan, Rishare Kci Kai or Saka Gakkai. Buddhism is practiced by an estimated 488,495,000,000, or 535 million people as of the 2010s, representing 7% to 8% of the world's total population. Early Buddhist schools. Early Mahayana Buddhism. Late Mahayana Buddhism. Vajrayana. Spread of Buddhism. Schools and traditions. Timeline. Theravada school. Mahayana traditions. Vajrayana traditions. Zen. Buddhism today. Demographics. Notes. Sources. Printed sources. Online sources. China is the country with the largest population of Buddhists, approximately 244 million or 18.2% of its total population. They are mostly followers of Chinese schools of Mahayana, making this the largest body of Buddhist traditions. Mahayana, also practiced in broader East Asia, is followed by over half of world Buddhists. According to a demographic analysis reported by Peter Harvey, Mahayana has 360 million adherents, Theravada has 150 million adherents, and Vajrayana has 18.2 million adherents. According to Johnson and Grimm, Buddhism has grown from a total of 138 million adherents in 1910, of which 137 million were in Asia, to 495 million in 2010, of which 487 million are in Asia. Over 98% of all Buddhists live in the Asia-Pacific and South Asia region. North America had about 3.9 million Buddhists, Europe 1.3 million, while South America, Africa, and the Middle East had an estimated combined total of about 1 million Buddhists in 2010. Buddhism is the dominant religion in Bhutan, Burma, Cambodia, Tibet, Laos, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. Large Buddhist populations live in China, Japan, Taiwan, Macau, North Korea, Nepal, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, and South Korea. After China, where nearly half of the worldwide Buddhists live, the 10 countries with the largest Buddhist population densities are. Subnotes.